Hello again. Today we're going to begin talking about the foundations of modern liberal politics. I'm going to talk in somewhat general terms about some of the basic underlying notions of our contemporary Western democracies, and we'll also talk in some detail about one of the most important philosophical treatises on the subject of politics, John Locke's second treatise of government. So we'll start with some generalities about what characterizes modern liberal political philosophy, and with an eye to distinguishing it from the pre-modern ancient Greek political philosophy that we've talked about earlier. Also, what I hope to do is to draw some lines from some of the things we've been talking about in our discussions of utilitarian and Kantian ethics and the modern liberal political ethos, because there are threads that come out of the modern moral philosophy of the West that we find in the modern political philosophy of the West. So today we'll talk about modern liberal political philosophy in general, and next time we'll talk about John Locke's second treatise of government, which is one of the foundational texts of modern political philosophy. Throughout our study of utilitarian and Kantian ethics, we've gotten a glimpse of a number of the building blocks of modern liberal political philosophy. And let me just sort of say a word about the word liberal. The words liberal and conservative have contemporary uses that are not the same as their sort of theoretical meanings, that is, the meanings that they originally carried when these terms were coined. And the word liberalism really goes back to the Enlightenment and to the political philosophy of the Enlightenment. By liberalism, roughly, we mean a political philosophy that is centered around the individual, the rights of the individual, the prerogative of the individual. All the contemporary associations of the word liberal with leftist politics, with socialist economy, with socialist economics, with collectivist mentalities. These are contemporary connotations that have no connection really to the original use of the word. Given the original use of the word, every Western democracy is inherently liberal in that it places an emphasis on the individual's happiness and on the individual's rights and prerogatives. So, when I talk about modern liberal political philosophy, I'm talking about the political philosophy that essentially underpins all the modern Western democracies, and especially the Anglo-Saxon ones, but really all the modern Western democracies are liberal in the sense that I will be using it today. So, what are some of the crucial ideas behind modern liberal political philosophy? There are really sort of three ground level or foundational ideas in modern liberal political philosophy. They are individualism, egalitarianism, and contractualism. And let's go through each of these and give a little definition. Modern liberal political philosophy is individualistic in that it rejects the idea of a common or universal human good. If you remember, one of the most basic notions of pre-modern ancient Greek political philosophy is that it is predicated upon a common conception of the human good. Right? So there's a general idea of human fulfillment that holds for every individual. And this is why one could base one's politics on the promotion of the good, because there's only one conception of the good, right, for all human beings. And the modern era rejects this idea, in part because of the scientific revolution, in part because the idea of there being a single good for an entire species is a notion that, after the scientific revolution, seems anachronistic, is unsustainable. So there's this rejection of the idea, the moderns reject the idea that there's a single good for all human beings, that there's a single conception of fulfillment that applies to all human beings. Modern individualism anticipates the possibility that there may be as many goods as there are individuals, that there may be as many conceptions of fulfillment as there are individuals. Right? So what individualism represents is an individualizing of the conception of the good. And thus the idea of a politics whose main purpose is to promote the good seems difficult to sustain, inasmuch as there may be as many goods as there are people, and the government, of course, the state, cannot promote them all. The second foundational idea is egalitarianism. And egalitarianism suggests two things. First, it rejects the idea of natural hierarchies, right? The idea of natural authority. So if you recall, in pre-modern political philosophy, in ancient Greek political philosophy, authority, political authority, is identified or analogized to paternal authority. Paternal authority is, of course, natural. It is authority that arises from nature. It is a matter of what they thought was the supreme fitness of the male head of the household. And similarly, political leadership was thought of as enjoying natural authority, right, by way of intelligence, right? Aristotle and also Plato believed that it's one's intelligence and reason that makes one suited to rule. And these are, of course, natural attributes. Well, the modern era rejects this idea. The modern era assumes that human beings are essentially equal and are not ranked in any sort of natural hierarchies. This egalitarianism is also in part and parcel of the scientific revolution, because once one looks at a human being through the lens of natural science as opposed to through the lens of religion or through the lens of natural teleology, once one looks at a human being through the lens of modern science, human beings all look pretty much the same. Right. There's very little, I mean, there are minute genetic variations, but for the most part, human beings, as seen through the lens of science, are equal. So egalitarianism involves the rejection of the idea of natural hierarchies, the rejection of the idea that anyone is born to rule and anyone else is born to follow. It also includes the belief in the equal value of each person's ends. So if individualism involves the idea that there may be as many ends or as goods as there are individuals, egalitarianism says no one person's good is any more important than anyone else's. So each person has an equal claim to pursuing their own conception of the good, their own happiness. Right? So we've covered even individualism, egalitarianism, and the third idea is contractualism. Contractualism is predicated on the assumption of the inherent self-sufficiency of the individual. Now, what do I mean by this? The pre-modern philosophers, the ancient Greeks, believed that man is by nature a social and political animal, that we, in a sense, are designed to live in society and to live under the authority of those most fit to rule. The moderns reject this idea. The moderns believe that people are naturally individualistic, that the natural state of a human being is to be an individual, and that, therefore, civil society and political life are contingent, not necessary. That is, we may decide to enter into social relationships. We may decide to form polities, but it's not necessary that we do so. Nothing in our nature entails that we must do so. This is why modern political philosophy asks both of the two questions that I said at the beginning of this part of the course characterize political philosophy. Remember, the first question was, why ought there to be a civil society and government? The second question was, what sort of civil society and government ought there to be? Well, the ancient Greeks wouldn't ask the first question because for them, civil society and political life are necessities. They are entailed by human nature. For the ancient Greeks, the sole question of political philosophy was, what sort of government ought there to be? What sort of state, what sort of civil society ought we to have? The moderns, however, do not assume that man belongs in a civil society or or need have political life, need participate in political life. So contractualism, I call this contractualism because the assumption that the moderns begin with is that any civil society or political life that there is the result of agreement, is the result of our individual decisions collectively to form a civil society and to participate in political life. Right? So social and political life are created contractually. They do not arise from nature. Okay. Indeed, the moderns take this to quite an extreme point. The moderns believe that all social, civic, political relations outside the household are rooted in contract rather than in nature. And even some of the household relations are believed by the moderns to be predicated on contract and not on nature. We today, for the most part in the West, treat the marriage relationship as a contractual one, not as a natural one, hence the availability and ubiquity of divorce. Right? There's no greater sign that the marriage relationship is a contract than the fact that one can and many do get divorced. The only relationships that still continue to be conceived of in naturalistic terms are the parent-child relationships. Right. So the modern philosopher's contractualism is quite far-reaching. Really, the modern philosopher conceives of virtually every human social, civic, and political relationship as arising from contract. And of course, this means that the modern political philosopher will also reject the idea of natural authority. Right? Other than the authority of parents over children, modern political philosophers, and I would argue most modern Western people, conceive of every other variety of social, civic, and political authority as arising from contract, from agreement, not from nature. It's for this reason that the most prominent, important liberal political philosophies go under the name of social contractarianism. This suggests or indicates this contractual view of society and government that we've been talking about. And if you think about what is the purpose of a contract, the purpose of a contractual relationship is to serve the interest of each of the parties. Right? The reason why I enter into a contractual relationship with you, and the reason why you agree to enter into it with me, is because we will both benefit from the association. So if you think about the social contract, this idea that civil society and political life are the result of contractual agreements between individuals, the basic function of society and government on the contractual view is to make it possible for each person to pursue his own individual good without interference from others. That's why we agree to live in society and under a common government together, so that each of us can pursue our own individual conception of the good or of happiness. Okay. So we've covered sort of the basic characteristics of modern liberal political philosophy: individualism, egalitarianism, contractualism. We've talked about the sense in which civil society and political life are viewed as contractual forms of life in the modern consciousness, and we've talked about in general terms what the ends of that contract are. The ends of that contract are to allow each individual to pursue their own happiness unmolested, so to speak, unbothered, not bothered by others. I want to talk a little bit more about the essential logic of contracts, because it speaks directly to the primary logic that's going to be employed in social contract political philosophy, and especially in Locke's second treatise of government. So let's talk a little bit more about the logic of contracts. I just said that whether or not a contract is justified it depends on whether the contract can be shown to be in the interest of both parties, of each party. And let's just sort of give a very easy, clear example. Okay. The relationship between an employee and a boss is a contractual relationship. Right? So I am employed by Missouri State University, and my relationship to my employer is a contractual relationship. Right? I agree to provide services for the employer agrees to pay me and to provide other benefits. The employer's authority over me extends only to the degree that the contract specifies, and is terminated once the contract ends. If either of us terminates my employment here, there's not a single person in this institution that has any authority over me anymore. Their authority is purely the result of the agreement between us. Now, if you ask the question, what justifies the contractual relationship between me and my employer, the answer is, it's in our mutual self-interest. It's in my employer's self-interest to have the services that I provide. It's in my self-interest to have the monies and other benefits that the employer provides. And notice that if this changes on either side of the equation, if this relationship ceases to be in either of our interests, the contract can no longer be justified. And it's typically then that the contract is dissolved. Either I quit or they fire me. Okay. The basic logic of contracts I'm going to describe as the rationally selfish person test. The question, is a contract justified, can be answered by inquiring whether it will pass the rationally self-interested person test. That is, would a rational self-interested person accept this contract? And the answer will be yes, if he perceives the contract to be in his self-interest, no, if he perceives the contract to not be in his self-interest. Okay. Now, let's extend this to politics. The first question I said of modern political philosophy is, why ought there to be a civil society and a government? In other words, why ought I to agree to live with others and to accept a common authority, also known as the government? All right, interpreted into the language of contract, what this basically asks is, why is entering into a social contract with others and accepting others' authority over me in my self-interest? And so the rationally selfish person test will as much be the arbiter of the social political contract as it is the arbiter of mundane contracts like those between employers and employees. Okay. And just like in the employee-employer relationship, in order to answer the question of whether the contract is worthwhile or justified, we would try to imagine what things would be like without it, right? So if I'm an employee and I'm trying to decide whether this job is in my interest, or if I'm a potential employee and I want to decide whether this job is in my interest or not, what do? I see what the job offers, and then I ask myself, would I be better off with it or without it? And so I imagine what life would be like without the job. Well, without the job, I wouldn't be able to pay my mortgage, I wouldn't be able to have my house, I wouldn't be able to make my car payments, so I decide that I'd be better off with the job than without the job. Similarly here, when we're asking the question, is it in my self-interest to live in the company of others and to sort of make compromises with others and to accept authority over me, the relevant sort of question to ask in solving in answering that first question is, well, what would it be like if I didn't live under these conditions? So when we ask the question, is the social contract justified, the way we answer it is by asking, what would life be like without the social contract? In short, what would life be like in a state of anarchy? This brings up the major sort of instrument of modern political philosophy, which is called the state of nature thought experiment. Every major modern political philosophy employs this mechanism, this device, and it really is a literary device. So the modern political philosophers will typically begin their treatises with a hypothetical state of nature. A hypothetical description of what human life would be like in the absence of all social contracts. That is, in the absence of civil society, the absence of the state, and in the absence of government. In other words, what would life be like in a state of anarchy? Because remember, for the moderns, the natural condition of a human being is thoroughly, utterly individualistic. So the natural state of human beings, natural state of mankind, for the modern philosophers, is the state of anarchy. The question is, would the rationally selfish person choose to stay in the state of anarchy, or would the rationally selfish person choose to form the social contract? If the answer is the latter, then the social contract, then society and government are justified. And we've answered the first of the two questions of political philosophy. Why ought there to be a civil society and government? Let me just introduce Locke's Second Treatise of Government, say a few things about it, and then we'll break, and we will next time go into the full detail of Locke's political philosophy and tie it together into this more general notion of modern liberal political philosophy and social contract theory that we've been talking about. John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, I would say of all the works of modern political philosophy, of all the works of political philosophy to come out of the Enlightenment, Locke's work most resembles and is most relevant to the democracies of the West, and especially to the democracies of the Anglo-Saxon world, by which I mean England, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Indeed, I often play a game with my students in that I read them excerpts from Locke's Second Treatise of Government, which, without telling them what it is, and they think it's from the Declaration of Independence or from the U.S. Constitution. That's how close these ideas are. That's how the sense in which these represent the core ideas. This book was published in 1689, I believe, and so it's a full generation before. It's a generation of literature before the literature of the American founding, and it provides a foundational text for the literature and of the founding and for the founders. It was the single most important work of modern political philosophy for the American founders. In many ways, the Second Treatise of Government served to justify England's glorious revolution. Right? So this goes by many names in the history books. Sometimes it's called the Glorious Revolution, sometimes it's called the Bloodless Revolution, sometimes it's simply called the Revolution of 1688. But what characterized the Glorious Revolution was the overthrow of the monarch, then James II, by the Parliament. And eventually the monarchy was restored, but in a diminished constitutional form. In other words, the Glorious Revolution marks the end of absolute rule in England, although there never was really pure absolute rule in England like there was in continental Europe. But never again after the Glorious Revolution did the king or queen exercise the kind of power in England that they had exercised before. And really marks the beginning of the parliamentary democratic period of English history, which continues on to this day. England is, of course, a constitutional monarchy still, but it is essentially at its core a parliamentary democracy in terms of its functions. And that really begins with the Glorious Revolution, and in many ways John Locke's Second Treatise of Government offers a brief on behalf of this. It is an argument on behalf of consensual government, and it's an argument on behalf of the right of revolution in the face of tyrannical government. And along the way, it articulates all of the fundamental principles of modern political philosophy. Like I was discussing a minute ago, it begins with an account of the state of nature, an account of a hypothetical situation in which human beings are living without social contracts, in the absence of all social and political contracts, and asks the question, does this form of life, does life in the state of nature pass the rationally self-as person test? If not, what does that tell us? What direction does that point us? John Locke is going to tell us it points us in the direction of a social contract, and it points us in the direction of a very specific kind of civil society and specific kind of political life. So let's break now. I realize that this is a short lecture, but I think that it will be best if we take our account of John Locke's Second Treatise as a whole lecture. In other words, I'd like to do the entire Second Treatise in one account. That will give us sort of its maximum sort of coherence and internal consistency. So until next time, have a good day, afternoon, evening, etc. And we'll come back and talk about John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Thank you very much.